just posted a podcast episode on my YouTube channel here about the Papa Rodger messages. In the episode, I go over about 10 to 15 of the messages, and I analyze them, and I talk about why they might have been written, who could have written them, was it the suspect, was it law enforcement, and I'm landing more and more on Papa Rodger being someone in law enforcement or associated with law enforcement, and in the episode, I'll explain why. Now, I don't think the suspect would be Papa Rodger, because I don't think that they would want to leave a digital trail. And because Papa Rodger was such a prolific commenter, I don't think they would, let's say they're using somebody else's device or a different device, unless they had one and they ditched it, which is possible. I don't know that they would have access to this other device. Because I would think that maybe they would use one let's say if it's Kohberger, they would use one at the school. If it's not Kohberger, they would use one at maybe an internet cafe. So I don't know if they'd always be able to get to that device in order to post as often as Papa Rodger did. And because Bryan Kohberger worked in or had an interest in technological forensics and forensic data, I think he definitely wouldn't want to leave any kind of digital trail. And I think we've seen that if he is the person who committed these crimes, he's done a pretty damn good job of cleaning up any possible digital trace or connection between himself and the victims. Now, like I said, I go over about 10 to 15 of these posts in the podcast episode, but I'm going to go over a couple of the more provocative ones here. And I will say that these posts, the sense that I get, the more of these posts that I read, is this was somebody trying to put together a profile. And at one point, Papa Rodger, he asked a specific question, I believe, about the suspect's height and weight. And people are like, why would you ask that? And he said it's necessary to put together, when you're putting together a profile, a criminal profile. So I do wonder, that's a little too on the nose, but I do wonder if Papa Rodger was a former profiler, a current, someone studying to be a profiler. Was he a student? I have a very hard time believing that it's a coincidence that the picture that Papa Rodger chose to use for their profile wasn't intentional. It's too eerily similar to what Bryan Kohberger looks like. So I tend to believe that this profile was created to somehow antagonize Bryan, because one thing that I found interesting was in the PCA, we learned that they first identify Kohberger and they get his name on November 29th. Papa Rodger starts posting on December 1st, and what's interesting is that a lot of the questions that he poses are very similar to the survey that Bryan Kohberger wrote. One of the first posts that I want to talk about here is the one that Papa Rodger wrote asking about, specifically he says, why did the killer choose that house over all the others in the area? Now, that tells me that whoever wrote that believes that the house was the target and not the people living inside of it, which is what I happen to think as well. And for that to be the case, I would think you would have to have been somebody on scene to know that. All the public knew was that 4 people were murdered, and there may have been a car involved. We didn't really know anything else. But it was police that first said that they weren't, that the house may have been the target, right? And then they lifted the shelter in place, which said to me, they believe that this crime is personal, that it's isolated, that this isn't a spree killer. And so I always felt that police also thought that the house was the target. Now, somebody answered this post and said, why was this house chosen? And this person says, potential reasons. It's a house full of girls. It's a house full of specific girls. It's a party house, was familiar with the layout, maybe got kicked out. The location, dark wooded area, lack of cameras. And Papa Rodger replies and says, "Excellent." Creepy, but and again, a little too on the nose for it to be the suspect. And I know everybody was like, only the killer would know this. Listen, I believe that the suspect would be in these forums, because this crime, what was done, this was a mass murder committed in 10 minutes. And I would think that the killer knew how unique that was, and would either want to brag or would want to take some kind of gratification from seeing people talk about his work. So I definitely think the suspect was somewhere in these forums. I just don't know that he was reading these I just don't know that he was writing these comments or these posts. Now, here's a really interesting one, and it's about the Google Trends. You know, they say Google Trends show that the search history for the house by date, or Google Trends show the search history for the house by date. Lots of Thursday activity. What do we think? And the Google Trends, the graph, whoever created it, started with the month of August. Now, why August? We know that's when Kohberger was stopped by the police. We know that's probably right around the time he was getting ready to start WSU, or maybe had already started. Whoever set that up seemed to be aware that August was significant in some way. And the only people who would know that would be the suspect, if it's Kohberger, or law enforcement. And the most intriguing post, at least in my opinion, is how long was the killer in the house? This is a question that Papa Rodger asks. How long was the killer in the house? That is the most talked about aspect of this crime. And at the time, because this was written on December 14th, we didn't know anything. We still thought that the crimes had taken place at 3 o'clock in the morning. The PCA hadn't been released. We didn't know how long anybody was in there. So that's a very interesting question. And again, it just brings me back to that 4chan post about the 19 minutes door to door. And Papa Rodger writes a comment and says, because someone says, well, how long do you think it took? And he says, 15 minutes. I go into more detail about this in the podcast. There's a link in the description to subscribe and listen to it. Now, the reason I think these are significant, or why I think law enforcement might be doing this, is, like I said, whoever committed this crime, and this is Dr. Gary Bricado, the clinical psychologist, says this as well, or he said it first, and I'm just agreeing with him. Whoever would commit a crime like this would be very ego-driven, very narcissistic, and they would want to take credit. They would now, if they're not Papa Rodger, they're going to see someone potentially taking credit for their work, and that's going to bother them. I don't know what the method why they would want to trigger him that way. I don't know. I'm not that educated, not as educated as Dr. Bricado. But I do feel as though these posts were made with the intention of sussing him out, maybe trying to find out if there's an accomplice. Is there anybody that has extra information or knows things that hasn't been released to the public? I don't know. Listen to the podcast, leave your comments. You can leave your comments here. You can listen to the podcast and leave your comments on that video, but just let me know. Now remember, this is just a handful of the posts that I talk about in the podcast episode. If you want to go through and listen to the entire analysis, just subscribe. You can listen to the episode. But either way, I want to hear your thoughts. Is there a post that stuck out to you or that was significant to you? Do you think it was Papa Rodger? Do you think it was the suspect? Or do you think it was somebody involved with law enforcement? And if so, what do you think they were hoping to gain by writing these posts? Were they trying to trigger the suspect? Were they trying to get information, find out a motive? Were they using this for research? Let me know in the comments.